how did you get interested in studying the physical evidence from the World Trade Center? Had you been suspicious from early on, or how did that start?
No, I was not suspicious on 9/11/01 at all. I saw the towers come down. I didn't see Building 7 come down until 2005, and that's when I really got interested. What got me going, Todd, was I had several friends and a PhD in physics also who encouraged me to look into 9/11, just all these nudges. And I'd like listeners to keep in mind, I provide nudges to people, and I'm sure they do too, and those nudges add up. After about 6 nudges, I decided, okay, I'll look into this. And then that's when I went to Jim Hoffman's site, which had references that I could, actually check things. That was wonderful. And it showed Building 7 coming down prominently, and with acceleration. To me, that was it was about enough to do it for me as a physicist. I've taught Newtonian mechanics for 21 years, but at that time, oh gosh, a long time. About 18 years. About 18 years at that point, and I can see there's something very strange about this. Of course, Building 7, the World Trade Center, was not hit by a plane. It had fires in it, but they didn't look too major to me, and they were random in any case. Yet this building came down on its footprint in nearly free fall speed, and there's more to that story. But anyway, that's what got me going, these nudges, and then seeing Building 7 come down.
That's very logical. It's wonderful that that you did respond to your nudges. We need more people like you responding to the nudges. So then, you guys, your team has gone on to investigate a wide array of physical evidence, and your findings have presented challenges to the official account that NIST provided for the disintegrations of the buildings, and I would say the most explosive results have been from the dust. So I was hoping you could go into what you think the most important aspects of your dust research have been.
Sure, be glad to, Todd. In that first paper, which came out in 2005, about October, online with the permission of the editors, as you mentioned, David Griffin and Peter Dale Scott, encouraged me really to put it online. My university didn't like that, but got away with it, so to speak, for about a year. Anyway, from my university research website, that was put online, so that brought a lot of attention. Anyway, in that first paper, I put out a request for dust samples. It just occurred to me that there ought to be some, if explosives had been used, there ought to be some trace of these explosives in the dust. And Jeanette McKinley was the first to provide a sample. She passed away last year, our dear friend.
Yes.
Very sad about that. But Jeanette was kind enough to provide a sample, and several samples, actually, that she sent to various people, including Kevin Ryan and Neil Basel and myself. And so it's been, then as soon as I started looking at this dust, I saw spheres using just an optical microscope. There were these spheres that were very unusual. Then I looked with, there's a lot of them, these spheres, and I used an electron microscope, a scanning electron microscope with electron microprobe, and found out the chemical content, the elements. And a lot of these spheres were rich in iron. Mm-hmm. And then they also had aluminum, which is a very strange combination. Aluminum and iron in a molten sphere. Where in the world does that come from? Well, by then, of course, we had seen the flowing metal coming out of the South Tower just moments before it fell to the ground, completely as it did. And that was consistent with the molten iron that's produced from the thermite reaction. So, and then aluminum oxide is also an end product of the thermite reaction. And then, of course, the high temperatures, up around 2,500 centigrade or so, has plenty to melt the iron. And then if you had sulfur, it melts steel and so on quite readily. But the point is that these spheres were consistent with the use of thermite, the thermitic reaction, iron, reduced iron, and aluminum in these spheres. Very often there's a lot of these spheres, and others observe these spheres too. We put that in our paper, the high temperature paper, which you referenced. I appreciate that. It's in the Journal of 9/11 Studies. I had submitted that to a physics journal, but they turned it down without even reviewing it. This is one of the problems you get into, is that these journals, you want peer review, but they won't touch it because of the implications of having incendiaries or explosives in the World Trade Center buildings. But we found that evidence in abundance. And then in June of 2007, I stumbled on these red chips. At first I thought these were just paint chips, and there are paint chips in the dust as well, but they're very distinct from the red-gray chips that we discuss in our paper, which we did get published in the Open Chemical Physics journal. We found a journal that would consider and peer review our results, which they did, and a pretty tough peer review at that, I might say. But they were published, and with color photographs and 25 pages. It's hard to find the journals that will do all that, but this journal did, and so that paper is out there. And these chips are quite remarkable. We're still studying them some. Let me see how if I can say this delicately. I don't have quite the research privileges that I once had at my university. So, but nevertheless, my friend there does. He's kind of keeping a low profile and continuing with research there. So that's good, and I work with him. And it's called transmission electron microscopy, and we have verified that the aluminum resides in these thin platelets. We don't know how to make these platelets, Todd. I mean, this is a very high-tech material. This is not just from buildings falling down and magically you have this high-tech explosive material, or I say explosive. I mean, it goes off with a very large energy release. So that's what I mean by that. The sound of it doesn't seem to be very large. So, but that's not required for explosives. Anyway, that's a little bit technical, but I use the term explosive. This nanothermite can be tailored to burn rapidly or slowly, loud or quiet, depending on what you put in there with it, you see. So it's really quite a remarkable material, and it is discussed in the literature of the national laboratories, the military laboratories like Livermore in particular and Los Alamos. And these references are in that same paper on the red chips that we talked about. The Open Chemical Physics Journal paper has all these references to the technical literature on this stuff. So yeah, it's there. It's in abundance in the dust. Shouldn't be there. NIST refuses to look for explosives in the dust.
Surprise.
Yeah. I mean, but they're open about it. They say we found no evidence for explosives. So I was talking to an investigative reporter, and I said, "Why don't you ask them if they even looked?" They say they find no evidence. So ask them if they looked. And so she did. She called up the spokesman, a fellow named Newman, for NIST on this World Trade Center study that Congress asked NIST to do. You see. National Institute of Standards and Technology. It's a lab under the Department of Commerce. So anyway, she calls up the spokesman for NIST on this World Trade Center project. She says, "Okay, you say you found no evidence. Did you look? Did you even look?" And they said, no, we didn't look. And she said, wait a minute, how can you say there's no evidence if you didn't even look first? And the guy said, why should we look for something that we know isn't there? It's a waste of time.
Amazing. Amazing answer.
It really is. It's amazing answer, and I quoted her in the 14 points paper, so people can get that reference as a journalist out in New Hampshire, as I recall.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about some of these details you've mentioned. First, regarding the Ironrich microspheres, could those microspheres have been produced by other kinds of explosives, non-nanothermitic, but more shockwave type RDX or other kinds of explosives? Would they have produced? I mean, these explosives are capable of breaking steel columns apart. Right. Would they produce microspheres in any abundance?
That's a good question. You see, let me point out these spheres. A lot of them have aluminum as well as iron, and that's an unusual combination that does point to the thermitic reaction, because those are the end products, right? Molten iron and aluminum oxide. So, and that's what we see in a lot of these spheres. So I don't think you would find that from cutter charges of RDX or HMX or C4, the normal used cutter charges. But mind you, we're not saying this is a conventional demolition. We never said that. The towers, anyway. The towers came down top down. That's not conventional. Although people have found Richard Gage, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, their team, a great group, by the way, which I, of course, belong to as well. So they have found examples where demolition has been done top down, but that's not conventional. Conventional, Building 7 would be more like a conventional, where there's something down low that cuts it, and then the building falls at close to free fall, which I'd like to talk about for Building 7. But anyway, close to free fall onto its footprint. That's generally the goal of controlled demolition as opposed to top down. So no one's saying that towers were demolished in a conventional manner, nor were they required to use conventional explosives. I don't know. It's so funny. We get these criticisms. Oh, it doesn't look like a conventional demolition to me. I agree with that.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it's not a controlled demolition. See, but yeah, the spheres with aluminum in them indicates thermitic and not just the application of C4 and HMX and so on.
So the spheres.
Go ahead.
So the spheres are actually a byproduct of the thermitic reaction. They're not. The iron there is not from the steel in the buildings. The iron is from the nanothermite.
Well, let me back up a little bit.
Okay.
I try to emphasize that, because a lot of the spheres have aluminum, but not all. A lot of them don't show any appreciable aluminum when we use the electron microprobe, the electron microscope. So what you have to say then is, yes, it's quite possible that there were other explosives used in addition to this nanothermitic material. That is quite, in fact, that's what I suppose happened. I suppose because if you look in our paper, again, on the red, just Google red chips, Jones, or you've got it on your...
Yeah, it's in the show page, yeah.
Right, of course. So you look in that paper and you go to a reference to a journal called AMPTIAC, AMPTIAC. And this is actually a journal put out by the Defense Department. And this is published in, it's on a conference that took place in April of 2001. And we have the reference to the paper there. And they're just kind of, bragging, is the term, about this wonderful nano-energetic material that can be used as a initiator, is the term, for cutter charges. And they have in Figure 1 a diagram of this nanothermitic material sitting there to set off the more conventional charge. So I think that's quite possible. even likely. Remember, we're not trying to explain in every detail. The dust doesn't give us all that information. What it does say is that there's explosive material there. This thermitic material is in evidence, explosive or incendiary, that cannot be just dismissed. It's scientifically demonstrated to be there, and it requires an investigation with subpoena power. Perhaps I'm thinking more now, I've talked about this, an international investigation. I don't think Congress is going to do anything because, we've seen their history on this. But anyway, an international investigation with, and to bring in people who will testify. I'd like to see Norman Mineta get a chance to explain a little more. His testimony, about that. And his testimony was left out of the 9/11 Commission report. So that tells you how important it was right there. And that relates to buildings, to the Pentagon, actually, and the flight coming towards the Pentagon. But the point is to get the details of exactly who was involved and how they did it in detail requires an investigation. I find the debunkers say, well, unless you can explain every intimate detail, we're not going to listen. I say, well, that's crazy. What other crime requires that? You find evidence, you say, okay, now we're going to trial, and it's at the trial that you get the details. That's the point we're at now. If we could just get this off the ground. I realize that the implications are such that politicians just don't want to touch it, but that's unfortunate because, this did happen, and there was funny business going on there, and so Mineta hit it on the head when he said, this plane was being tracked 50 miles, 30 miles out, 10 miles out. Nothing was done. That was the essence of his testimony. And
yeah, very important.
Right. So right there and he was reporting to the young man was reporting the progress of the plane to Dick Cheney. So I suppose you remember, Todd, back in 2006, I and others called for impeachment of Dick Cheney based on this and the
yes,
torture,
I do remember.
Right, and the lies that got us into Iraq. I mean, there's a whole list of things that he did that certainly appear illegal and immoral and contrary to democratic society.
Impeachable.
Impeachable, right. And we pushed that hard, but it didn't. Well, that is right about that time, as that was actually gaining some steam, that I was put on administrative leave, and I think that took some wind out of the sails. But anyway, whatever, that's the sort of thing that we need is to get at subpoena power and get some justice for these people. I'd sure like to see that.
Well, from my perspective, you and your team of co-researchers have laid out such strong evidence to making a case for such an investigation that
right.
I think your call is completely reasonable. I want to ask you about whether or not there has been any substantive scientific counter-arguments, any scientific disagreements with your findings. For example, in the active thermitic materials paper that found the nanothermitic materials in the dust, have there been any scientists who have tried to debunk the methodology or the results in your papers? And
sure.
what kind of arguments have they used? Do their arguments have any kind of credibility at all?
Okay. Now let me point something out. And the answer is yes, and I'll talk about these people or some of them. It might take the rest of the time if we.
No, we don't want to spend all the time on it.
But let me just say. See, none of these guys have published a paper that refutes our paper. Ours is a peer-reviewed paper published in an established journal, and until this is the way the scientific community works. Once you finally break through and get in the literature, as we call it, the peer-reviewed literature, now another scientist, if he's going to challenge you, he needs to publish in the peer-reviewed literature himself, his challenge. No one has done that. So we could leave it at that. But let me say that arguments have not been very strong. The most recent one is by a Canadian, not a physicist, Dennis Rancourt. And he said, well, the aluminum that you guys claim, he says that could just be the pedestal which had aluminum in it. And, and he pushed and pushed on that. And, it's just ridiculous. I've tried to explain, or Niels Harrott in this case was communicating with him, the carbon tape that we use to hold the chips, that's a conductive tape, is thick enough that the beam won't get through, the electron beam won't get through the carbon to the aluminum, A. B, this is not pure aluminum, it's an alloy, and we don't see the other element showing up that's predominant there. But even more important than that, C, is this latest work I mentioned briefly, which is the transmission electron microscopy work, which shows the platelets in the red chips very clearly, these thin, about 40 nanometer thick platelets that contain the aluminum. I'd sure like to know how to make this stuff, these platelets. But anyway, they're there, and that's where the aluminum is. And this is without any aluminum holder at all in the TEM. It's a copper holder, so there's no possibility of contamination there with aluminum. And we home in on the platelet, and there's the aluminum sitting there, as we said in the paper. We could see that. So his argument is just, I don't know, these guys get a bug in their, for some reason, in their bonnet, and they just push and push. But it's just ridiculous. If anybody's, I wonder if he's ever used a scanning or transmission electron microscope. He can answer his questions easily. In fact, why doesn't he get some testing? You can check it out, But instead, they don't do experiments, these debunkers. I've never seen any of them analyze the dust. Not one of the debunkers, not one. Another one is Greening. Greening agreed with us finally, because the chips, we broke them off, 4 of them, so that we get a fresh surface. There's a whole bunch of junk in the dust. So you break off the chip to get at a fresh surface, and you see aluminum, iron, oxygen, silicon, and carbon. Those are the main things, and that's about it. There's no zinc in those chips when you get a clean surface. In the dust there is, of course. There's zinc from whatever, and all sorts of, like galvanized piping. But not in the chip when you break it off. There's no zinc at all. So I had this, so Greening was wondering about that, and we knew that the primer paint used in the World Trade Center had a lot of zinc. And there is no zinc. So he finally conceded. He said, okay, it can't be primer paint because there's no zinc. But Professor, what's his name, at MIT, who's not a physicist, he's an engineer.
I'm sorry, I don't know who you're...
Yeah, he's been on my case for years. He made a statement in the press. He said, well, when I saw Jones getting into the press, I decided I will get in the press too and knock him down. Words to that effect. I mean, that's pretty close to what he said. But in this case, Thomas, come on, brain, Thomas, senior moment, here. Thomas.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank too. I've probably heard the name too.
Thomas Eager, that's it. Eager.
Oh, Thomas Eager, yes.
Yeah, so he said... So he looked at our paper, and it was in the news, too, in the Deseret News here in Utah. I didn't get as much of a splash as we'd like, but that was actually a pretty nice write-up in the Deseret News. And anyway, so he writes to me a nasty email. He says, that's just paint. And I said, look, where's the zinc? You have to agree that the paint, we looked at the paint using the scanning electron microscope and the electron microprobe, and sure enough, the paint used in the World Trade Center has zinc, a lot actually, and that's what the NIST report said too. It has zinc. And I said, "There's no zinc in these chips, so how can you say it's paint? This primer paint?" And you know what? He would not back down. It's again the bee in the bonnet thing. We disproved that it could be primer paint, and that's not the only thing, the zinc, but the methylethyl ketone that we soaked the chips in, and they did not dissolve as a paint does. I mean, it gets limp, and it dissolves significantly as time goes on. The primer paint just reacts totally differently from these rugged. I mean, they're brittle, but they're tough chips. They're like a ceramic if you try to break them, okay? But they're not paint. And we went through the, no zinc and so on. He says, nevertheless, they are paint, and that's it, And I said, look, Professor Eager, we've shown you the evidence. There is no zinc. They behave differently in paint solvent, totally different. How can you maintain? Nevertheless, they are paint. Would you do an experiment, sir? No, I won't do, and so on. Well, this is the type of thing that we get.
Well, and paint chips wouldn't go off, wouldn't react energetically when subjected to heat like these chips do as well, right? Doesn't that separate?
We put paint chip through the differential scanning calorimeter. That will be on the test, by the way. But anyway, we put the paint through just like we did the chips, and it behaves totally different. Paint does burn, and that's what it does. It burns, and you get this ash, this flaky stuff. No iron spheres. There's another thing. When you burn these red chips, you get iron-rich spheres. And again, a lot of them, but not all, have aluminum entrained in there with the sphere. You get those same spheres that we observed in the dust. I mean, the case is open and shut. Scientifically, it's very strong. And yet, these debunkers sit back. They won't do experiments. They complain about this and this. You explain what the real facts are, and no, it's paint. It just gets to be ridiculous. I mean, of course, they can't publish that. There would not be any peer-reviewed journal that would let them get away with nonsense like saying it's paint when they have no proof at all. And it's contrary to the fact. But nevertheless, they say it, and they keep saying it, and it's just remarkable. And it is unfortunate because the public tends to depend on scientists, and then, but they don't understand sometimes that even scientists get ego or whatever. I don't know. Well, maybe they're being paid by somebody to debunk.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of interests here and pressures on people here, and we're not in a situation where we assume everybody's pure and operating.
Yeah, let me amplify that thought just a bit, Todd. I was approached by a fellow. His name is Martin, and this is just as soon as my paper came out in October of '05. I mean, just within days, he wrote to me, and he threatened me, get that paper off there, your career will end, which it did, actually, when it's published. He said, if you try to publish this, then it will end. And that's indeed that. It was published in August. In September, I was put on administrative leave, and that was it. But
so
anyway,
you were threatened, yeah.
I was threatened, but the other thing he did, when the threats didn't work, I said, look, I'm a scientist, I'm going to pursue this, and I think it's important to humanity to know what really happened on 9/11. So excuse me, I don't have to, just yield to your, what he was saying was, his terminology was endangerment. He kept saying, your research endangers. I said, endangers what? Well, what it endangers is the Bush-Cheney administration, of course, but he didn't put it in those terms. It endangers society, is what his argument was. And he said truth doesn't really matter so much. If you endanger, truth is irrelevant. That was his argument. It's really quite interesting. But then he offered me what I considered a bribe. He said, look, if you will write up a research proposal based on how you could counteract the effect of fires in large buildings like the World Trade Centers were, then I can guarantee you that you will get a large grant from the Department of Homeland Security. He said he had contacts with those guys. And, I don't mind talking about these things rather freely. But this guy, he was writing to me and to administrators at BYU with the threats and then the bribes. And I said, if I accepted a grant for looking at how to counteract fires, wouldn't that be a change in my, a thesis of that I'm working on here, and demonstration that an experiment to show that explosives exist there And he said, yes, it would require a change in your research direction. It's just funny. So obviously, if I'm approached like that, there must have been others approached as well. It makes sense. And,
absolutely.
So you have to expect that.
Well, let's talk about what some people have called the Achilles heel of the official account, which is WTC7. I mean, the towers came down very rapidly with, pretty explosive action at the top. All this sudden dust creation and expansion outward. And WTC7 came down in a different manner, but it came down extremely rapidly. And when people look at that, it looks so much like an implosion that they're familiar with. Do you agree that WTC7 is really the Achilles heel of the official account?
Well, yeah. I mean, there's several Achilles heels, though.
Yes, there are several. It's true.
Okay, that is certainly a main one, and I really love this Building What campaign. I think they're doing a great job bringing awareness of Building 7. People see it just like I did. When I saw Building 7, I knew there was something very suspicious, and then, the evidence piled up for the official story to be not just misleading, but the biggest lie of our generation. And so, and all the things that followed the 9/11 wars and so on that these guys wanted clearly before 9/11. Anyway, so Building 7. You see, we were watching NIST because when I got into this, NIST had promised a report on Building 7, is again the national lab there, commissioned by Congress to explain the fall of Building 7, the collapse. They called it a Building 7. So they kept postponing, and then right at the end of the Bush-Cheney term, administration, right at the end there, they came out, or out towards the end. It seemed to me that was, might have been pushing them. Let's get this done before the new guy gets in. Anyway, they came out with a preliminary report, which was, frankly, full of holes from a physics perspective. So they had a public seminar online where you could send in questions by email, which I did, and David Chandler sent in a very similar question. What I asked, well, one thing I asked them if they'd look for red gray chips in the dust, which they hadn't. They said, no, we're not going to do that. Kind of weird, just get away with it. No, we're not going to. Anyway, then I said, look, in your report, you say about the rate of fall. You say that you assume that it fell at constant velocity. And I said, now look, I've looked at the data, as have others, and by George, that thing is accelerating, which is not constant velocity. There's a difference between going 25 miles an hour, steady, and tromping on the accelerator and just accelerating as fast as you can. There's a big difference.
Yes, there is.
So I said, look, the thing is accelerating. How can you say this in your report? Did you look? Did you even look, you guys? So it turns out they hemmed and hawed, and then they said, well, we'll take a look at that one. And David Chandler pushed them to look for acceleration too. Great fellow, doing a lot of good work, physicist, So anyway, so in their final report, lo and behold, they've got a plot showing the rate of fall of Building 7. And by George, it shows free fall acceleration at 32.2 feet per second squared, which means there is nothing in the way for over 100 feet. So this roof is able to fall at free fall. Free means, nothing in the way. Free to fall, okay? And it's in free fall for over 100 feet. And this is just what we're saying, and that requires, how are you going to move all this? There's hundreds of thousands of tons of steel and concrete in the way. It doesn't even have to be, strong, just sitting there. I mean, maybe it's crumbly for some reason, but if it's sitting there, it'll slow the roof down as it hits it. That's conservation of momentum. Fundamental physics, just easy. But it's free. So that means something has moved this stuff out of the way. over 100 feet. That's over 8 floors, or about 8 floors. So how are you going to do that? Well, it takes explosives. There's nothing else that can move all that material out of the way. So what do? They put in there, because we pushed them, Dave Chandler and I, they put in there, sure, it accelerates at free fall. But then so you think, well, okay, let's drop the other shoe now, follow up on that. What does that imply? No. They put in a sentence saying, and this is consistent with our computer model. So we said, well, okay, let's see your computer model. No, we're not going to reveal it or share, or no FOIA, anything you want. No, we're not going to disclose the computer model. So then we looked. They did have some graphics that they said were generated by the computer model showing the fall of Building 7. Well, it's not at free fall acceleration. I mean, what a joke. These guys get away with these things. I mean, as a scientist, I'm just appalled. I mean, you push them and push them, they finally admit free fall acceleration, and then you say, okay, well, what's the meaning of that? What does that mean about the collapse? Well, wait, it's in our computer model, blah, blah. Total nonsense. And obfuscation. I don't know what the word is. Fraud is what it is, which is the most serious accusation I can raise against another scientist. But that's what they're guilty of. When they say, they admit it's free fall, and then they say, well, that's okay. It's still caused by fire. No, that's fraud.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology is the government agency responsible for making sure that scientific standards are used in all kinds of government activities, and maintaining standards for the country by which all kinds of things are regulated. And so if they're producing reports that are full of errors or falsehoods, that amounts to scientific fraud. And David Ray Griffin, in his book Mysterious Collapse, actually identifies several different types of scientific fraud. And
great
it seems
book,
that,
by the way, great book.
It is a great book, and it seems that NIST and the people who produce these reports, they're going to be criminally liable, it would seem to me, down the line when the investigations, actually finally happen.
Right. They need to stand up. I have heard from people who have been in NIST, and they say that the guys there are not proud of their report on the Building 7 or the towers either, as far as that goes. They both have holes, and they realize it, but people are worried about their jobs, they tell me. Which I can understand, sympathize some level, but that doesn't excuse. I would rather accept a retirement or resign than tell a lie. I just won't,
Right.
So I can't sympathize totally with these guys. They should at least resign, if they know that their organization is producing fraudulent science. It's sad.
I agree.
And it's a very harsh accusation, but so let's have an investigation. I've called for that. And it's not just, as you mentioned, David Griffin and I in talks also, and in the 14 points paper, I think we talked about some of this. Well, like the refusal to look for explosives in the dust. I mean, how do they get away? And then they turn around and say, we find no evidence for explosives. Well, that's disingenuous, isn't it? To say we find no evidence and you haven't even looked and you refuse to look, that is disingenuous, which means, lying, fraudulent.
Right.
I don't know how these guys get away with it. It's just amazing. But I'm afraid, here's one thing, before we run out of time, Todd. We've talked about the science, and it's a travesty what they're trying to pull on us. Really, the cover-up here at these levels is remarkable. But what I'm trying to say is there's something rotten in Denmark here, in the U.S. And the government, but at very high levels. I'm not saying all government workers are that way, not at all. But at high levels, there's been this problem. So what do you do? What do you do about it? And I do want to address that a little bit as we get down to the last of our time.
Yes.
Okay, so let me approach that. So we push NIST. They admit some things, but they won't go some places, like they won't look for explosives. They won't discuss the true implications of free fall of Building 7. See, they'll go so far, but you push them, but then that's it. They won't look further. Okay, so that's NIST, and then similarly with 9/11 Commission report here, they had testimony by Mineta, but do they follow up? No, they don't even include it in their report. They didn't have the collapse of Building 7 in their report either, 9/11 Commission. I mean, what a joke. It's supposed to be the most complete treatment of 9/11 and all this thorough and so on. Well, that's baloney. They left out the most important parts. So anyway, what do we do? It's like...
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, what do you think we should be doing? Should our highest priority goals be?
Several. Okay, here's what I think we need to do. First of all, as individuals, then as a truth-seeking community, we continue to promote the truth, and we seek for an investigation and for justice. Frankly, I think that's an important part of it. Then,
I agree.
Yeah. Okay. Then, failing that, because that's a continual effort till we get enough people and momentum to get that through. But meanwhile, I mean, I'm one that believes that there will be justice one way or the other. The justice might be quite harsh if it comes from another country. That's what I'm concerned about. To be frank with you, as I look at relations of the United States with, say, China and Russia, I think those guys are pretty much wising up. Iran certainly is wising up to 9/11. Not that they'll talk about it too much, but, they see what is being done here.
Sure.
So my concern is that, the justice might be from outside. We are not immune from a real attack, not a false flag one. But so what do we do? Well, and then these guys in charge up there, let me just call them the elite. They call themselves something like that, the elite, the money people, the international globalist corporations and bankers. Excuse me, I think that's...
No, that's fine. Those terms are all good.
All right. So what do you do? Well, you try to live as independent of these guys as you can and stop supporting them as much as you can. Now, one way, frankly, when my pay went down dramatically, it was painful. But now I'm saying, well, I don't have to pay as much taxes. I don't have to go shopping, like Bush said, after 9/11. Please go shopping. Well, I'm not a Republican shopper anymore. I'm sorry, I used to be, but that's been a long time ago. So I got out of that. So, you try to live independent. And food, I would recommend, I've been pushing this for 3 years anyway, is having some food storage. Food prices now are starting to jump up. I don't know if you noticed, but
yes,
they're jumping up, and the trick is they're like tuna. It used to be a larger can. Now they go to a smaller can, same price.
Right. Yeah, I've spotted that too.
And so that's happening all over. Burritos, I know, a smaller bag is same price. So unless you're paying attention, you hadn't realized that the price really went up quite a bit on you. And cocoa is going way up, and so on. And I don't think these are just fluctuations. I think what these guys are doing to the dollar and the bank bailouts and the quantitative easing, give me a break. Yeah. They're just counterfeiting money is what they're doing. So what do you do? Well, you say, well, let's see. If I can get my own food, I've got a place here where I can, and I have a pretty big garden. I don't know, that food safety bill that might be inspecting my garden, but, nevertheless, you do what you can to be independent. And I find around here, this little rural town where we moved, just about everybody has a wood-burning stove. Say they took the grid down. I mean, just as an example, but I think that might have one reason and the other. Blame it on something, but anyway, when the grid goes down, I'll put it that way, you better have some backup heating for your place. We've got wood-burning stove, and we've got some propane, and we can certainly get by. And people are talking about underground. It's a good way to go to get the burn principle, so you get the warmth into your shelter. I have a son working on that. I'm working with him on that. It's a great idea. This winter, it's not quite as warm as we had hoped in there, but it's certainly well above freezing, and it's livable. It's a place you could live, and in the summer it's cool. That works fine. In the winter, it's not quite as warm as we like. But what I'm getting at is we try to be independent, and then as a family, and that seems to be a unit where we can pull together. Most of my children now are on board with preparing, and whatever these guys throw at us, or even if it's foreign country. Oh boy.
Do you have?
It could be rough. It could be rough if we don't own up to the mistakes that have been made, and call our leaders to justice. Impeachment. That's what's in the. That's our right as citizens, is to call for impeachment. By the way, that's one thing at my university. They told me, don't talk about that, and don't talk about Cheney. So I know there's pressures on them. I knew there were pressures on them. But, I told them, it's a constitutional principle here. And so, anyway, I didn't survive that. But, as far as my career. But, like I say, I'm learning to be independent, and I like that. Now, there's one other area I want to mention, Todd, and that has to do with energy. These elite seem to want to control energy worldwide. I think that's a fair statement. And it's probably a large reason for the wars in the Middle East, the 9/11 wars. It's actually to control energy, because there's a lot
I agree.
Okay, fuel over there. Now, so it turns out my career, which was cut short, but I'm still doing research. And what I did as research for decades was alternative energy. I was looking at fusion, and in particular muon catalyzed fusion and metal catalyzed fusion, which we could talk about, but I'm trying something new now. Still looking at metal catalyzed fusion some, but I don't think the promise is there at all unfortunately, for energy production. But there are other methods that we are looking at. Probably, until we actually make the measurements and are definitive, I probably don't need to go into the detail on that. But I'm just saying that if we, and there's little communities, like the 9/11 Truth community, there's a freedom energy community that is looking for alternative power. Now, if we could get that, you see, then we could declare energy independence, which goes a long way to declaring independence from these globalist corporations that seek to have a stranglehold on energy, and thereby controlling the world, basically. Because if you control the energy, you basically are controlling society. And so I'm seeing that, and I'm saying, well, let's see if we can find another source of energy, a source that would be suitable for individual homes, possibly, or communities at that level, 1,000 people. Energy source, and totally off of fossil fuels. No carbon dioxide emissions either. I'm not sure I want to get into that right now, but nevertheless, it's a good thing to get off of fossil fuels, if for nothing else, because these guys are controlling the fossil fuels, thereby controlling society, and they're trying to get people in debt. Well, get yourself out of debt. They're trying to control food. This food safety bill is a move to that. Well, get yourself a garden. Maybe move to the country, like my wife and I did, and now we're joined here by 3 of our children, and a 4th will probably be coming. So we're doing these things to try for independence from the globalists. And Carol Brulette has talked about this. Bruyere, I guess, if I pronounce it in French.
Yeah, I think she does. Yeah.
She does, and I know others have looked into it. I think it's actually a very important part of the movement that we can proceed now to get. Well, there's enough of us. We can get independent of these globalists. That's my spiel about that.
Well, that's very interesting. Now, I wanted to ask you just a little bit about this ongoing 9/11 related research that you're still engaged in there with colleagues. What are you working on there, and when might your results in these studies be published, do you think?
Right. Well, as I mentioned, we're doing transmission electron microscopy work, which is tedious, to say the least. And as it happens, I'm not permitted to use that equipment at my university, but my colleague is. It's kind of a complicated story. But anyway, so that's going along. And when there's that.
And that's on what materials are you analyzing?
This is on the red thermitic material. Yeah.
Right.
In particular, we're trying to understand. We've already determined that the iron oxide is Fe2O3. That wasn't too hard, nor was it too surprising. The aluminum in these platelets is much harder to get a grip on, partly because the platelets are so thin, and then also they're in this organic matrix, which these methods, we can't really tell if there's, with these methods, if there is, what the composition is. We know there's carbon. We can see the carbon. If there's any fluorine, it's hidden behind the iron peak. We haven't seen any fluorine by itself. So, the method is limited, but the aluminum is particularly difficult because of the fact that it exists in these platelets that are so thin. We're still working on that. We're trying to do XRD, but we tried with two independent labs. I guess I'd call them independent, two labs. In other words, none of our team was doing. We gave them the sample. Would you please take a look? And they are just having trouble.
Now, what is the purpose of these lines of research?
Oh, it's to follow up to show just how the aluminum, in particular, exists. We've got the iron oxide nail that exists in these little grains. They're quite uniform. You see photos, or they're really electron photomicrographs in the paper that show the little dots, the faceted iron oxide. Problem is the aluminum. Yeah, it's a scientific step. I don't know that it'll make a huge difference as far as
it's just to understand.
Right, and the point is these are high-tech materials. This is not just a building falling down and producing these marvelous uniform platelets that contain aluminum. We haven't been able to figure out how they make these platelets. It's a puzzle.
Yeah.
And the other thing that we're doing, which a paper on Building 7 discussing the free fall, and that'll be a little more accessible to the general public than this other study. But I think it will. I hope so. But the point is,
you've got coworkers who are working on different projects as well in different places, right? Your team as a whole is still working in different areas.
Yes, actually, Kevin Ryan is doing some work. I'll let him discuss it as he wishes, looking at the red chips with a different approach. And that work is still going on. For myself, I just have to say, my time is a bit limited because of the work that I'm doing on alternative energy. And I think that's very important. So I've told the group, our group of scientists, that I want to do that, and they said, sure, that's understandable. So
well, that's
proceeding,
fantastic. Well, great. You guys have just done some fantastic work. We're all in your debt. We're just down to the last minute now, Steve, and so we really have to break off. But your work has been marvelous, and we're very grateful to you for coming on the show today and discussing it in detail and giving us your ideas about, other related issues that we need to be concerned about. I want to thank you very much for coming on.
It's been my pleasure, Todd, and best wishes to you and to the entire truth-seeking community. We've got a good group of people.
We sure do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.